through 1688. So it's about a century, from 1588 to 1688 in England. In this unit, the absolutism unit, we've talked about many different countries. And what we see is that Spain is going to move on this government continuum that we've been talking about towards a dictatorship during the age of absolutism. During the age of absolutism, of course, with Louis XIV, it's going to move towards a dictatorship, right? One person having all the power, an absolute monarch. We did not talk about Russia yet, but when we do, you'll see that it moves towards a dictatorship. Now, the one exception is England. During this time period, through a pretty complex series of events, England moves from an absolutist system, think Henry VIII, really closer towards a democracy. Now, do they get all the way there? No. But they make a lot of progress in this century from 1588 to 1688. Now, this slide right here, I'll leave up for a second, and it's a great one for you to pause to look at an overview of what happened. This is the order of events, and there's 6 more. So you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Please feel free to pause the video if you want to look at these more in depth. And of course, you should know all this. You are responsible for it. And here, here is 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So those, you can pause the video once again to look at these. So these 12 events are really what we're talking about here today. We're going to break it down a little differently, and you'll see how we do that in just a moment. Your key terms for today, we have a new dynasty, the Stuart dynasty. We're going to see a civil war. We have several new monarchs, as well as a new military leader, Oliver Cromwell, who also serves as the leader of the country for a while. We have, King Charles II, King Charles I, we have King James II, William and Mary. We have lots of people that you should know about, and actually there's a few more you'll see as we go through the notes. So the overall order of events we have, first is the English Civil War, and after that will come the English Commonwealth. Then we'll see the Restoration, and finally what we call the Glorious Revolution. Looking at the Stuart dynasty. Now, if you remember from class, before the Stuarts were the Tudors. You remember there was Henry VIII and his 3 children that ruled. Edward VI, and then Mary Tudor, or Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary, and then finally Elizabeth. Elizabeth was the very last of the Tudor line. If you remember, she was called the Virgin Queen because she never married. She had no children. So England was kind of in a tough spot. They had to find a monarch. So they found this new line from Scotland that was kind of a distant relative of the Tudor line. The Stuarts are going to be invited from Scotland to come rule as kings of England. So they will at the same time be kings of Scotland and England. And it's pretty interesting how it all turns out. We'll take a look at that. The Stuarts are going to be the dynasty that loses absolute power for the English monarchy. You can kind of look at this like they messed it up for all the kings and queens to come. Some notable Stuarts, well, the first one is James I. If you've ever heard of the King James Bible, he is the guy who was responsible for the translation of that. By all accounts, he was a pretty knowledgeable guy. He was a pretty academic guy, and generally well-liked. But he was the first of the Stuarts to serve as king in England. Charles I, I nickname him the Headless. You can probably guess why. He is executed and beheaded. Charles II, I call him the restored party animal, and that's because he comes back and he becomes king again, and everybody celebrates and parties like crazy for a really long time. James II, I call him the fleeing Catholic because he is run out of England and basically flees and runs away. And guess what his religion was? He was Catholic. And finally, William III, although not a true Stuart himself, we usually put him in the line of Stuarts because his wife was. This is William of William and Mary, who served as co-regent. And we call William III the Glorious Revolution's champion. He's the one who led the Glorious Revolution, and we'll talk about what that is. Yeah, so there you go, William of William and Mary. So you will be responsible for knowing all these people. You should know that they are members of the Stuart family, know what role each played in this time period. The first event we'll look at is the English Civil War. This was from 1640 to 1650. Charles I, the second king of the Stuart dynasty, was greatly disliked by his people. First of all, he married a Catholic princess, and you know England is the stronghold of Protestantism, and they did not like that. Additionally, he started trying to control the way Parliament could run. He tried to control the way they could spend money, the way they could raise taxes, and Parliament, which was like our Congress, the legislative body at the time, pushed back. He started making changes to the religion, started making it more open to the ideas of Catholicism and a little bit closer to the Catholic faith. And basically, Parliament was freaking out. So what did he do? Charles I dissolved Parliament. When we say someone dissolves Parliament, that means they tell Parliament, or Congress for that matter, right, a legislative body in the government, they say, go home. You're no longer allowed to meet. And of course, Parliament hated this. The people hated this. This was a step by Charles I to extend absolute power. So what did Parliament do? Parliament raised an army. This army would be known as the Roundheads. And there's a couple different explanations for why they were called that. But one way to think of it is, you know, the common people had kind of regular haircuts. And these haircuts at the time kind of were what we would consider kind of a bowl haircut today. But the people fighting for the king's army, like the royal people and the noble people, they wore those long white wigs at the time. So if you looked at the Parliament's army compared to the King's army had this long flowing hair. The Parliament's army, they had these bowl haircuts. So they were nicknamed the Roundheads. They would be led by someone named Oliver Cromwell, who we'll talk about in just a minute. The Cavaliers were the King's army. They fought for Charles I. Now, if you remember what happens to Charles I, or what I said happened to Charles I, you could probably guess who wins. Go ahead, guess. Parliament wins. That's right. Yeah, Parliament wins. The Roundheads win, led by Oliver Cromwell. They win in battle, and they arrest the king and execute him. They behead Charles I. This is the first time in English history that the people have executed a king. So after the English Civil War, once again, take a look at the dates, 1640 to 1650, England sets up a brand new government, and it is called the English Commonwealth. The English Commonwealth is the only time in English history that there is not a monarch. It's a new form of government completely. They did choose someone to lead the government, and that was the leader of the Roundheads, the leader of Parliament's army. They chose Oliver Cromwell to be Lord Protector. He was not a king. He was not a monarch. He did not have absolute power. But England saw this as a very dangerous time, so they did grant him a lot of powers. Something interesting about Oliver Cromwell was that he was, of course, a Protestant, but he was of that Puritan group that we've talked about before in class. He had many laws passed that were ultra-conservative. We call these puritanical laws. And they were strict religious laws. One way to think of Oliver Cromwell is that he thought smiling was a sin. He thought anything that would make people happy was a sin. Like, you shouldn't be happy. Hard work was the only way to be godly. Everything else was ungodly. So you could see some of the things he did here. He closed all pubs, which are a very important part of British culture today. He closed the theaters. This is in the birthplace of Shakespeare. And he closed the theaters because he thought they were a distraction from our godly duties. He banned most sports. Women were not allowed to wear makeup. and they had to be completely covered from their neck to their wrists to their ankles. And he even banned Christmas, which is kind of interesting because he is a Christian, right? But he banned the Christmas celebration, and he banned churches from celebrating Christmas because he thought it was going the wrong way and people were not focusing on the religious nature of it. And frankly, he thought they were celebrating too much. So, would you like to live in Oliver Cromwell's puritanical England? Go ahead, answer that question to yourself. Would you like to live there? Well, neither did the English people. In fact, they got so sick of it that they kicked him out. I'm sorry. Let me take that back. They did not kick out Oliver Cromwell. They kicked out the government. Oliver Cromwell died of old age, and after that, they said, you know what? This is enough. We've had enough. His son was put in charge for a minute, but he wasn't really good ruler. So they said, we need to get back the monarchy. That's when England was strong. That's when England was great. So what do? They get on the phone and they call Charles II. Of course, there was no phone then. I'm just using that for purposes of explaining. They called Charles II. They sent a message to him and they said, Charles, we need you to come back. Now you could think why this might be a little awkward. Because what did Parliament do to his father? They chopped his head off. And now they're saying, sorry we killed your dad, but would you please come back and restore the monarchy? As I said, Congress was filled with these people called royalists who wanted the monarchy back. And they wanted a new king. They said that this didn't work. It was too depressing. It was chaotic. We need a king. People looked at this like celebrities, like we look at celebrities today, as a great opportunity to enjoy the celebration and the pageantry of the king. And when the king returned, and here's a picture of it right here, a drawing, it was a huge party. For the first time in 10 years, the pubs opened, the theaters opened. Charles II is known as this kind of party animal, that he was always willing to have a party regardless of why. Because it was kind of his attitude. But it was also such a difference from Oliver Cromwell, right? So Charles II was very popular, but like all people, he grew older and he passed. And James II became king after him. James II was Catholic. And now, if you remember anything about England at this time, it was the Protestant stronghold of the world. Parliament hated King James II. So what did they do? They got on the phone. Once again, there was no phone there. They made a phone. They sent a message. They sent a letter. They sent a courier to William of Orange, William III of Orange, who was living in the Netherlands. He was a royal member of a very small area at the time, compared to England at least. It was quite small. He was married to Mary of the Stuart family, and she was actually the second in line to the throne. And they said to him, listen, William, we have this terrible king right now. We need to kick him out. Can you help us? And he was like, well, why would I do that? Why would I bother, leaving where I am? They said, we will make you king of the most powerful, maritime power, one of the most powerful countries in the world. But there's a catch. And he said, well, what's the catch? They said, you will have to sign the English Bill of Rights. The English Bill of Rights would pretty much limit the power of the monarch. So you can imagine William of Orange thinking, well, should I do this? Like, I could either be a ruler of a smaller country, or I could be the ruler of a great, large, very important country, but with minimal power. I'd have to give up power to the parliament and to the people. Ultimately, he decided to go for it. He landed with an army and there was hardly any fighting at all. James II fled. He took off. That's why I call him the fleeing Catholic. And just as they agreed, Sir William and Mary, his wife, signed the English Bill of Rights. The English Bill of Rights was a very important document and very similar in many ways to the American Bill of Rights. These two are going to rule as William and Mary. That is called ruling as a co-regent. A co-regent is when there is a king and a queen together ruling. They signed the English Bill of Rights, and ever since, I'm sorry that this cut off here, but ever since, Parliament has had the true power in England. So you look back on this, why did the British people call this revolution in 1688, 1688, 1688, why did they call this the Glorious Revolution? What do you think? Well, they called it glorious because to them, they got the power. The power was now with the people. They now had certain protections that were very similar to our Bill of Rights here in America. So taking a look at the English Bill of Rights, this was signed in 1689 officially, there's no royal interference with the law allowed, which means the king could not interfere with legal proceedings. The king could not tax directly, only Parliament could tax. So that limited the funds that the king could raise. People could sign a petition, or they could demand change with the monarch without fear of the monarch coming after them. We have a freedom of petition here in the U.S. The king was not allowed to have an army in times of peace. And the king had to have permission from Parliament in order to have an army. We've talked several times in this class about how an absolute monarch has a large standing army. This pretty much eliminated that and made the army loyal to the Parliament. We see they can't get involved in the election of Parliament. The king or queen cannot get involved or interfere with the election of members of Parliament. We see here that freedom of speech is guaranteed. And we see here that cruel and unusual punishments are not allowed, or excessive bail. These are things that line up very interestingly and very closely with our Bill of Rights, which will come about 100 years later. One thing to really look at this time period, this 100 years, it's complicated, right? First we have the English Civil War, and they behead a king, and then there's the Commonwealth, and it's very conservative with puritanical laws, and people reject that, and they bring back the king, and the Restoration is this huge party, and everybody loves it, and then James II comes in, and they hate the guy, so they chase him out of town, and William and Mary come in, and in order to take power, they need to give up power to Parliament. It's a very interesting turn of events. What's the significance of this time period overall? This 100 years, what happened? Well, England went from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy. Under a constitutional monarchy, the monarch does not have absolute power. The monarch has to work within the guidelines of a constitution. One way I usually like to say, to explain this to students, is that before this, the king was above the law. And now, after this, the king is under the law. The law is higher than even the king. So here you could see a little summary of what happened. I just quickly recapped that. I'll be interested in seeing what you guys think about this time period. I also have some videos that I'll be sharing. Please ask me any questions you have. And of course, be prepared to answer questions about any of these monarchs, any of these royal families, any of these events. You are responsible for all of it. I hope you enjoyed this. I certainly did.